today, you pass the loan application on to your boss with your little tentative approval, but you don't make the decision. Your boss makes the decision, and they don't get their home loan. And you never even know what happened. So it's your job to submit to the authority of your boss. Another thing that can happen with home loans is the era of redlining. Now, redlining went on for decades, and it was a very handy service provided by various levels of government to banks, advising them on neighborhoods that were thriving, neighborhoods where the value was going up, neighborhoods where they were putting in new shopping malls, or neighborhoods where the opposite was happening, neighborhoods where the bank was less likely to be able to get that loan paid off on time and make their planned profit off of that loan. Government was very helpful in telling banks about that for decades. And for decades, the losing neighborhoods were always those where people of color lived, often where they were forced to live back in the days of legal discrimination. Back when we had not just segregation by custom, is what we have now when it comes to where people live, but segregation by law. And remember, just because we got rid of the law doesn't mean we're not still practicing the custom. Law and custom are two very powerful things, and they can go against one another. When the law said it's no longer okay to segregate, some people were very upset, others were very happy. But all you have to do is go like to the ASU cafeteria. You see very few dark brown faces, and they're usually sitting together. That's segregation by custom. So, homeownership by race. And notice where I got my information. It's always good to know where things come from. And I think all but one of my graphs has the source here. So the Census Bureau and the American Community Survey from 1990 to 2015, and this shows home ownership rates. The gap is actually widened since the beginning of the 20th century. It hasn't gotten better, even with all of the, I would say, increased number of white people who are not prejudiced and would like to see other groups get a fair chance. Even with those changes, even with the increase in mixed marriages, we still see that the gap in homeownership is not getting any better. Now, we used to have active government intervention trying to stop it because of prejudice. Now we usually have, well, there are still other programs. The very same decade, the 1960s, that we were talking about getting rid of redlining and other programs, and actually did so in many cases. That the 1960s was when freeways really expanded right through the middle of urban areas. They always went through the poor neighborhoods where the government could buy the homes for next to nothing, force the people out, divide the neighborhood, put a freeway right through the middle of it, making it harder for people to get to school, making it harder for people to get to neighborhood shopping, and making it much more convenient for other people who didn't live in the neighborhood blighted by America's freeway programs. Freeways almost always went through African American, Puerto Rican, immigrant, Native American. Those are the neighborhoods that the freeways cut through. So even with redlining gone, the government no longer boasts about dividing people that way. There are still other programs in place that work almost as badly, much less intentionally, but just as badly. And so in this graph, which comes from, in part, the Census Bureau and a compilation by the University of Minnesota, we can see that all of the gains that were made once the Fair Housing Act of the 1960s and 70s was introduced, all of those gains that began, even though they were putting in the freeways, all of those gains were, well, reduced, eliminated. Other races, Asian Americans tend to do fairly well, at least economically, in our racial system. We expect them to be well educated and intelligent and be things like doctors, and they may still be discriminated against, but with money, it helps them to do a little bit better. So you can see a 6% loss and even whites are not doing as well with the current economic situation. So corporate decisions impact the poor and people of color in lethal ways. It's not just going to make it harder for you to get ahead, it can literally get you dead. And so, for example, infant mortality rates. In the past decades, hundreds of small hospitals in inner city neighborhoods and rural areas have been bought up by corporate chains. They're closed down and their assets are sold off for profit. And then the people in those areas have to travel really long distances to find a hospital. And even a clinic, often the only opportunity to visit a doctor, the only doctor office was associated with a clinic connected to the hospital. Increasingly, we have health deserts in the United States. And so if we look at places like the rural South, where we have an awful lot of African Americans still living, and the poorer neighborhoods in our largest cities, it's causing things to occur such as the horrific infant mortality rate for African Americans, 11.4 compared to 4.8 for white people in the United States, almost triple what it is for white people. Babies not going to live more than a few months because of our system. And a lot of those people who are shutting down those hospitals, with the inevitable result is that people don't have access to medical care and might even have something like a 65, 75-mile drive while they're in labor to get to a hospital. Survival rates are going to go down for the adult, but also being able to check on the baby after it's born, the birth process itself, because it took so long to get there. Not good, not good. Our racial system even sets the parameters of how long you're going to survive. And so the life expectancy for a white American, 78.9 years. Asian Americans, oh my goodness, 87.1 years. Again, very high rate of education, more access to money, and much more likely to have a doctor in the family. Latinos diet, the traditional Mexican diet, if they're eating that, rice, beans, lots of vegetables, not a lot of fatty meat, not that much sugar, contributes to their health. If they're well adapted and they're sucking down the Coca-Cola, like way too many of the people in Mexico are now doing, well, they might start declining. But look at Native Americans and then African Americans, more than a decade less than Asian Americans. And again, this is from the CDC. And in the past year with COVID, life expectancy for African Americans has gone down 3 to 4 years. That many of them have died off as a result of COVID, and it's drastically altered the numbers for their population overall. The life expectancy of an American in general has actually gone down a year because of all the deaths because of COVID. And Hispanics, it's gone down between 2 and 3 years in life expectancy. A lot of it has to do with pre-existing conditions, especially the very unhealthy common African American diet, lots and lots of junk food, and exposure, working in jobs where they cannot work from home and are going to be exposed to COVID-19. And it doesn't have to be that way, because over the decades, millions of people in a variety of groups have been admitted to white privilege. We could keep expanding that through changes in the way citizens act, government, and our business systems. We could choose the way changes have been made in our racial system in the past. Now, for a moment, think about the United States coming into existence out of 13 British colonies. White people back then were English, a few Scots, not that many, mostly English, a few Welsh, not that many, French, German, and the Dutch were here. Remember, New Amsterdam was the original name of New York City. So you have people from Northwestern Europe. They were the white people. And then, of course, you had lots of Native Americans in the beginning still being wiped out by government policies. And then you had the Africans brought over. You didn't have people from other parts of the world. You didn't have a lot of Middle Easterners here, hardly any. You didn't have people from Italy, Greece in the beginning. You didn't have people from Poland or Russia or the Czech Republic. There was no Czech Republic back then. Actually, there was no Poland back then either. White people came from a very narrow part of the world. And then more people started coming, but originally Protestant. Remember, I said that race is irrational. Your religion could determine your race. Jews. Well, what if you're a blonde-eyed, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German and you're Jewish? Are you a different race from the other blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans? Hitler wanted you to believe that you would be. And in fact, in Hitler's Germany, Jews looked so much like the rest of the people of Germany. Some of them had brown hair like Adolf Hitler. Some of them had blonde hair. They had to wear the Star of David insignia sewn onto their clothing whenever they went out of doors, so that you could easily tell who was Jewish and who wasn't Jewish in Hitler's Germany, because they weren't that physically different. These are Jews who had been in Europe for well over 1,000 years. And so Catholics is another way. And please don't think I'm putting statements of fact or reality. In parentheses here, I have statements of what has been believed in our racial past about these groups of people. And I thought the names for Jews were so awful, I didn't even put them in. There would be nasty names for them. There would be assumptions about them. I think it's interesting that the group I belong to, Eastern European, the nice name for us was Alpines. We came from the wrong side of the Alps, east of the Alps. Oh, not so good. But deriving from the name Hungarian, and also from Bohemia or Bohunk, came the nasty word hunkies. And hunky has come down to us in two ways. Honkies, the insulting word for white person that was used by African Americans in the 60s and 70s, is derived from what other white people insultingly called Eastern Europeans back when Eastern Europeans started immigrating here. And the word hunk, the term for a sexy man who's pretty much brainless but plenty of brawn, also derives from Eastern Europeans who had a lot of hard physical labor jobs when they first came over here. If you think a man is a hunk, you're actually calling him Polish or Slovakian by using that term. And of course, the Irish. At one point in the Eastern industrial cities along our coast, in the middle of the 19th century, 1800s, Irish were ranked below Negroes in the racial hierarchy of our northern industrial cities. And you've probably heard the phrase, no Irish need apply. They were too white. That red hair that went with their pale, pasty skin, oh my goodness. There was even the concept that there was such a thing as Black Irish. You know, if they managed to escape the stereotypes that went with having red hair, over emotional, over sexual, because they had dark brown or black hair, then they were called Black Irish and compared with Negroes. Mediterraneans, Italians in particular, you don't even have to go back that far. In our lifetimes, if you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, and you needed somebody to be the criminal in a movie or a lousy novel that didn't have a lot of thought put into it, the criminals would all be Italians, the mob. Before we had black gangs, we had Italian gangs in all of our pop culture literature. And they were considered the worst criminals of the lot because they had not enough brains to be moral, but just enough brains to get organized and create organized crime. Greeks were usually mistaken for Italians and lumped in with them, even though they did not have the criminal history of organized gangs. They were kind of guilt by mistake, mistaken for Italians, but both were considered members of the Mediterranean race. So we had all of these assumptions about people coming over who were not part of the original group of white people, and every one of them had to separately not fight, pretty much the opposite of fight, had to toe the line repeat over and over again, yes, sir. Anything you say, sir. They had to be good and pure and clean to make it into the white race. And eventually they were allowed white privilege. Nowadays, I am white, even though when my grandfather originally came over here 135 years ago, he would have been considered not the same as a white person. They were referred to as the inferior races of Europe. Some groups, once excluded from whiteness, have officially made it in, though the public are, well, there's law and there's custom. Look at the legal definition. This is the definition that was attached to the 2020 census form so that people could figure out which race box to fill in. And white includes all individuals whose nationalities or identity is from the ethnic groups of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So if you're from Egypt, you're a white person. If you're from Sudan, you're a black person, even though you have family in Egypt. If you are a Jew from the Middle East, if you are a member of Al-Qaeda from the Middle East, if you're an Arabian from the Middle East, our government says you're white. The general public of the United States hasn't bought this one, doesn't go for it. But our government has officially declared. Now, 20 years ago, when I worked for the 2000 census, people from India were white people. They've been shoved back out of whiteness in the official categories. Used to be because of the Aryan diaspora. Remember, Hitler was all excited about the Aryan race? People who speak the Sanskritic languages of India speak an Indo-European language linguistically related to the languages of Europe. Because about 5,000 years ago, people started pouring out of an area somewhere around Ukraine, or not the country Ukraine, but the Ukraine, the steppes of Western Russia. And those people immigrated into Europe carrying the Indo-European language, and they also immigrated into India. Historically, yes, people from Europe are related to people from India. But remember, we have the dark-skinned Indians of southern India, or at least they were pushed south when the Aryans invaded thousands of years ago. Oh my goodness, thousands of years ago history. Why do we even have to think about this? Well, sometimes race labels you because of your religion, and sometimes race labels you because of an invasion that happened in prehistory. But people from India are no longer white. Oh dear. And then we have white Hispanics. And I noticed when I went to the website, government website run by the CDC, to track my vaccination for COVID-19. And every week they send me a question and I say, no, I'm still fine. And every week they still ask me whether or not I'm white. And once I say I'm white, I have to say whether I'm white Hispanic or non-white Hispanic is another one of the possibilities there. Race never makes sense. It just doesn't. And so we have white Hispanics, they're from Spain. really interesting thing about the Hispanic race or ethnicity. It lumps people from Spain, Portugal. It lumps linguistic groups. If you're Brazilian, you're Hispanic, even though you're a Brazilian whose ancestors are mostly African and Native American, you're Hispanic. If you come from the Philippines, where they speak the Spanish language and have done so for centuries, people from the Philippines in Asia are also Hispanic. This is a really interesting race, the Hispanics. So you can see the official definition of white over here. Okay, now the reason, a lot of the reason for a lot of racial decisions that are made is made because of economic opportunity. The middle class that we take for granted is actually an invention of the mid-20th century. You had much wealthier people before then and much poorer people before then. Two things combined in the middle of the 20th century to elevate the working class into a comfortable middle class. And I think of the comfortable middle class of the working class is those people who do not have to live paycheck to paycheck, people who own a home, people who have health insurance, people who have savings, people who may even have investment accounts. And we have lots of people like that because labor unions were very powerful in the middle of the 20th century, becoming more powerful in the middle of the 20th century. And they helped push forward the decision on what do we do with all of these immigrants working in America's factories. The Irish, the Poles, the Slovaks, the Italians, the Greeks, the inferior races of Europe, in other words. The labor unions excluded them in the beginning and only fought for better pay for the white members, and it was legal to do that. But gradually over time, they realized that the bosses were using the immigrants against them in their organizing attempts, and the only way to win the organizing attempts was to include the immigrants. This allowed the immigrants social interaction with people who were already English speakers, native born, allowed them to share food, make friends, learn customs, and become acceptable much more quickly through labor unions, which were smart enough to have lots and lots of social interactions for their members. And then very quickly, because they depended so much on them to win in labor disputes, they began electing them to leadership positions. Oh my goodness, Polacks do have brains. Wow, big change. Also, the post-World War II GI Bill, it rewarded every male who served. It very intentionally discriminated against every female who served. A woman who served in the United States military and helped defeat Hitler did not get a boost towards a college education or a low interest home loan. Only the men did. If she wanted to benefit from that, she had to marry a man benefiting from that. However, when it came to African Americans, segregation was still legal, as well as a custom in most of the North. And so they couldn't move into the new suburbs that were being built because they couldn't get home loans. Redlining was still legal, And when they walked in and asked for a home loan to move into the suburbs, they were told, you're not allowed to live there by law. And if they said, well, okay, we'll buy a house in the Black neighborhood, they were told, we're not giving loans for houses in the Black neighborhoods. We can't make profit on a loan in the slum. So even though they were technically entitled to the GI Bill, they did not get their little house in the suburb. Nor could most of them get a college education because colleges were still segregated. Appalachian State was still segregated for a couple of decades after the guys came home from the war and wanted to use it as a young man to go to college. Fewer than 10 African American colleges existed in the United States at the time of the GI Bill. And boy, was it ever competitive to get in. Most people didn't get in. And so college education, home ownership, that whole generation, when the Poles, the Slovaks, the Irish, the Jews, the Italians were being welcomed into the middle class by being welcomed into the white race, African Americans and the very few Native Americans among us were being discriminated against, as were some of the Hispanics. And so that is what I have to talk about. And I hope y'all have some questions for me.
Linda?
Yeah.
Can you turn yours off?
Feedback.
I heard that the reason African Americans were buying Cadillacs in the 50s and the 60s was because the Cadillac company was the only car company that would give loans to African Americans.
I did not know that, but it's entirely possible. Also, for people in the United States, the biggest thing people own, their greatest investment for the American middle class is their home. That's where people put their wealth. And if you can't get a home and you want to put your wealth into something that will give you status and store your wealth for you, unfortunately, a Cadillac depreciates a lot faster than a home, but that was the closest they could get, was buying that Cadillac.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Linda, my name's Herbert Hash. I served in Germany in the military, 63, 65. When I came home, I was able to get help with continuing education through the GI Bill. I never really had thought about it being available only to males. Initially, it eventually did include females, did it not?
Yeah, it did later. Yeah. But at the beginning, when it really mattered, when the big change was happening, they were excluded from that first generation of the World War II returnees. Yeah, my dad got a GI Bill loan on our little working class box, but oh, we were so fortunate because it had a little bit of land with it. We had a creek in the backyard. Wow. And the African Americans who fought beside him were still stuck in the slums.
Yeah, I didn't realize that we discriminated so much against women. Of course, the women didn't have a right to vote in America until 1960?
1920, women could
1920.
vote 1920, yeah.
Yeah, Susan B. Anthony, 1920.
But my grandmother couldn't vote when she was a young woman.
Of course, the Civil Rights Act, 64, Voting Rights Act, 65. It took us a long ways to get that far.
Yeah, it did. It really did. And we've still got a long way to go. And the
Yes.
thing is, it's constantly changing.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Constantly. Like the people of India, no longer, not even white on the government form, let alone in the eyes of their neighbors. But this concept matters so much. I mean, look at the life expectancy and the incredible shock of what COVID-19 has done to the life expectancy in a year. A 4-year loss in a year for African Americans and a 3-year loss for Hispanics. An awful lot of Hispanics have jobs in those meatpacking plants where the survival rate, oh my God.
Linda, would you comment on the class thing keeps coming into this?
Yeah.
In America, do we have a bigger class problem than we have a racial problem? Sometimes I think they're all tied together. Sometimes I
They
think.
are.
Okay, that's what I'm hearing you say anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, social scientists, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and social scientists like anthropologists and sociologists have a word for it. It's called intersectionality. And they'll get you because you're poor. That will combine with your gender, that will combine with your race. If we look at income for African Americans compared to white Americans, that's one thing. But then if we add, well, are they male or are they female? Then you've got an even more drastic drop. Women in America make 79 cents on the dollar for what men are doing. Actually, I think I heard it was up to 81 cents, but now we've got the massive unemployment of women because of COVID, which impacted women much more drastically. But if you look at, so it's 81 cents, last I heard, female compared to male for income. But then if you look at Black women, it's only 60 some cents compared to a white male. And so those things, everything combines.
Class and race.
Yeah, and I used to teach a course called Gender, Race, and Class in the anthropology department at ASU. And I would tell my students, one of the worst things about being in the non-dominant race, one of the worst things about being female is how it's going to hit you money-wise. What are they going to do to you if you're a female-headed household? You're going to be poor. If you're a Black household, you're going to be poor. If you're a Black female-headed household, you're going to be really poor. And so it's the combination. And, look at things like racism, this traditional idea that the dominant white male try to convince one another of that the non-dominant races are after our women. And they use the excuse, we're protecting our women from the other race. They use sex and gender to promote racism. And you can find instances of that all over the place. And two, all of those people who are part of the system, who are doing their job, bringing about racist outcomes, not intending, because they're not prejudiced, they're doing it because of money. They're doing it to make money. Oh, we can employ this person at a lower rate because we're discriminating against them because of their race or their gender, but we're not doing it because we're against their race or their gender. We're doing it to get rich by exploiting them.
Oh, man, comment,
Yeah.
Linda. I'm thinking about this replacement theory of Tucker Carlson with the Fox News.
Oh yeah, I've watched that a little.
That I don't know. That really bothers me. It seems to be pure racism to me. What is your take on that?
It is. That is definite prejudice. I mean, the idea that there are even these completely different races that are going to replace one another, and when they do, the value system will change, and how, you know, what we consider good and what we consider bad behavior, all of that is going to change when we're quote unquote replaced. You know, the mob in Virginia where that woman got run over, they were marching around with their torches after dark, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Whatever that means. But race and racism don't expect them to be logical. Were you with us last time? I'm not sure I remember you from the last one.
I think I did miss the last meeting.
Okay. Well, I was talking about the logic of a brown-haired, hazel-eyed German being the leader of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed German master race. It, you know, that little item alone kind of highlights the illogic of racial systems. And yet there's a logic of people making money
Yes.
off of it. If it wasn't for class inequality, then it would be, why bother to do the rest?
I wanted to just say that I put 2 books, Chuck knows of these books, in the chat.
Okay.
2 books that I highly recommend. The Origins, it's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, and Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. I highly recommend you read them in that order.
Okay.
Maybe you want to say something about them, Chuck?
Just that they're both awfully good. The book called Caste, after reading that, I thought to myself, that's the best book on race I've ever read. And then Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again. Glaude is just piercing in the way he analyzes race in this country, and it's really good also.
And using James Baldwin's
Yes,
essays
exactly.
and books and writings to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah, Caste unites the idea of even more than a class hierarchy, but you're frozen into your class and you're never allowed to get out of it.
Yes. Yeah, she says that the word caste captures more accurately the issues of where we are in this country along these lines. The caste is more accurate than the word race.
And she's doing a comparative analysis of Nazi Germany and India and the US.
Mhm. Yeah, in India, of course, most of the lower caste, well, not necessarily, it depends on your region, but a lot of the lower ranked castes in India that have been locked into their low position for generations, for going on 3,000 years, are the darker people, the original native people of India. And then you've got that Aryan invasion of the lighter skinned people from Russia who brought the Indo-European religion, which became Hinduism, with them, and the caste system justified by the religion. Oh, a really interesting thing about comparative systems. Gandhi was high caste, and yet he had great sympathy. He really wanted to see a future India without the caste system. And he experienced being lower caste when he was hired to work in South Africa as one of the second from the bottom racially ranked people who was brought over there. He got to see what it was like being drastically discriminated against in South Africa, no longer highborn, but suddenly lowborn because of the group that he belonged to. I don't think he would have been who he was if he hadn't gone through that experience of the racial system and being near the bottom, not the very bottom, but near the bottom of that system over in South Africa. Let him go home and then see what he was really looking at for the first time in a whole new way. Oh, Marilyn, you're talking, but you're.
I am.
Okay.
I was going to say Kamala Harris's family is from Brahmin, the Brahmin caste.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the people who make it over here from India are high caste. And unfortunately, I have never read a study of this. This is only anecdotal. I have encountered Indian immigrants who came to this country because they did not like the way that lower caste people were. They have what is essentially an affirmative action program over there. It's very weak. Very few low caste people get into it, but if you get into it, you can still be a very low caste person and get a college education to become something like a doctor or an engineer. And some people who immigrate to the United States are coming here because they're horrified by that and want to get away from having to work near low caste Indians. I hope it's very few, but I have met some.
Well, one of the stories she tells in the book when she's talking about Indians, the caste book, it's low class. I can't remember the name for the lower class Indians, but they're getting into high tech.
Dalit?
Pardon?
Dalits?
Yeah, that is one of the names. Yes, and they're coming over and getting into working in IT out in California, and then other higher class caste people are coming in, and this one particular person who was lower caste was not indicating anything that would give up his caste status back home, and the upper caste people would say, ask questions about his family and where he was from and all sorts of questions to dig at him to get at that information. And the upper caste people also wear under their clothing a little ribbon under their shirt, and they would pat him on the back to see if he had one.
Wow.
Or get him to undress when they would go swimming, to take off his shirt. They were just trying to find out about his caste, trying to be discriminated, I guess, here. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I had a friend in grad school. She was Nepalese Brahmin, and we were both graduate teaching assistants. We were both in the photocopy room doing our job. And she said, this is very low ranked work. If my parents could see me, they would make me come home right away. But I want to stay here. But I mean, to her, her caste was a threat to her plans, and she was rebelling against her family. And I mean, you know, it was like going out and getting drunk or something. She was doing something bad and therefore fun because her parents wouldn't approve. It's all about wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, I think
Is
we're
the cat-
done.
Is the caste system still legal in India?
It,
Thank you for doing this.
oh, well, we had a question about the caste system, which I'll try to cover quickly. And somebody else who might know more about it might also want to throw something in. The Constitution of India, when they got independence, drastically weakened the caste system and spoke out against it. But as I said, with our country, there is law and then there's tradition. And so there are parts of India where the majority of the people are much more equal with one another. And there are other parts of India where it's still incredibly strict. And you can still go to a restaurant where the people cleaning up the tables are required to crawl across the floor, reach up to grab the plates and put them in a bin and drag it across the floor, because the head of the bottom caste or outcast, the untouchable caste that gets the dirty jobs like that, their head has to be below the heads of their superiors. And if you're in a restaurant sitting at a table, the only way for people to keep their heads below you is for those people to crawl on the floor. And they still do that.
So it's more tradition today.
Yeah. Oh, and again, COVID is exposing so much. When India suddenly went into lockdown nationwide a year ago, all of the low caste people who were migrant laborers within their own country, working for next to nothing, living hand to mouth, getting paid at the end of each day so that they can buy enough food just to work tomorrow, suddenly had to travel hundreds of miles to get home. And there were people who starved to death trying to walk those hundreds of miles last year because of the caste system in India. And COVID spread among them like crazy. They had no housing, they had nowhere that, you know, they had nowhere to go to shelter in place. They had no shelter. Millions of them trying to get home. Anybody else something to add on the caste system?
All right. Well, thank you, Linda. I'll have this recording on tonight or tomorrow morning, probably tonight. The other two recordings are there. So if you want to review them or see ones that you missed, go to HCLLL on YouTube, and you'll get all of the recordings from this year of High Country program.
Excellent.
Yeah.
There's a couple I missed that I would like to see, so thanks.
Uh-huh.